Mr. Administrator, thanks so much for joining us.
Good to be with you.
1 year into the Trump presidency, President Trump likes to give firm, clear direction to his administrators, cabinet secretaries. What did he ask you to do with this agency, and in 1 year, what have you accomplished in pursuit of that directive?
You know, the president has been so focused on results. And when you look at the world today versus when he came in, we're safer today, but we're more optimistic and more prosperous in the economy. And I think a lot of it has to do with what's going on domestically as far as regulatory reform and regulatory certainty. We had many regulations that this agency had adopted historically that had created confusion and then not served advancing protection of the environment. So we spent the past year trying to achieve regulatory certainty, regulatory clarity, to make sure that people knew what was expected of them so they could invest, achieve good outcomes for the environment, but also know that there wasn't an agency in Washington, D.C. trying to pick winners and losers in the marketplace. So I think the president has done an extraordinary job at impacting the economy in a very positive way, and we see that in all markers. And there's much optimism as we head into 2018.
And is the philosophy in accordance with that directive to protect the environment or protect business?
Well, it's neither. I mean, our focus here should be on stewardship. It should be on taking the statutes that we are vested and responsible for administering, from Clean Air Act to Clean Water Act, and adopting regulations that are consistent with the authority in those acts. I mean, what the past administration did, as you know, is created regulations like the Water of the United States rule that defined a water of the United States as a puddle in Arizona. And so imagine if you're going to build a subdivision in Arizona and you've got to get permission from Washington, D.C. because you've got uncertainty about the use of your own land. The Clean Power Plan was an example of this administration picking winners and losers in the development of electricity, in the generation of electricity.
The loser would be coal.
Choosing renewables at the expense of what? Natural resources that we have.
Meaning coal.
Well, across the full spectrum, natural gas and the rest. And so this agency shouldn't be in the business of saying we're going to favor certain sources of energy over others. It should be taking the Clean Air Act and adopting regulations that are an extension of our authority. And you know this, Major, but the Supreme Court, because the past administration did that wrongly, intervened and issued a stay against that Clean Power Plan because it was so unlawful. So that doesn't achieve any outcomes for the environment or the economy.
And your position on clean air, for example, is that effort did not take into account other aspects of clean air that you want to prioritize. Do I understand that correctly?
Well, when you look at attainment in this country, you know, air
help
attainment,
air quality
what
does that mean? What does that mean?
Well, air quality standards that we set for years. Something called the Ambient Air Quality Standards Program, where we set standards for every area of the country on how to improve outcomes for SOx and NOx and ozone and particulate matter and all those types of things. And as we've done that, Major,
SOx and NOx,
yeah, yes.
For the audience?
Pollutants that we regulate under the Clean Air Act, the mainstay of what we do. 40% of the country, as we came into this position, as the president came into office, 40% of the country, 120 million people, live in areas that don't meet those standards. And that's what we've really said to, focused upon here, is how do we improve outcomes there? How do we focus on achieving real, meaningful progress at improving air quality standards in those key programs? How do we improve investment in water infrastructure to prevent Flint, Michigan, and Gold King, Colorado? How do we eradicate lead from our drinking water? You know, those are issues that we can focus upon today that are tangible, beneficial outcomes for our citizens, and we're not speculating about what may be happening in the year 2100 or beyond.
So answer your own question. How do you do that without creating uncertainty or new regulations for business? Don't you have to do that?
Well,
don't you have to tell them to do things they're not doing now?
Absolutely, and you do that consistent.
Even if they may not want to?
You do that consistent with the statutory authority, and that's where the past administration missed it, is because they went to things like the Clean Water Act and they created these rules out of thin air that the industry and citizens and states across the country said, that's not consistent with your authority, and it created this litigious, uncertain environment, and progress wasn't made. And so what we've said is, let's get back to the basics, focusing upon rule of law, focusing upon process, focusing upon federalism principles, learning from the states and partnering with them to achieve good outcomes, and also setting clear guidelines and rules in place so that industry know what's expected of them.
So let's talk about that, what you just said, statutory requirements in the realm of chemical regulation and household chemicals. 2016, Congress passed a new law after a long series of debates about how to do that.
TSCA.
Yes. Yeah. There is a sense that you and this agency, under your direction, are backing away from some of those things when it comes to consent orders and requiring chemical companies to adhere to what Congress wants them to adhere to make sure household chemicals are safe for the purpose they're sold for, but may be safe in other alternative uses.
Well, I mean, what's interesting about, the question, Major, is that when I came into this position, we had about 700 chemicals that had not been reviewed at all, that before they could even enter the flow of commerce, it was a requirement under that new law that they be reviewed up or down on whether they posed a risk or not. 700 chemicals, a backlog when I came in. Made a commitment to our team here that we would address that backlog by the summertime, and we got that done by July. We had an obligation under that same law to pass 3 rules last year to provide clarity to those in the marketplace. Got all 3 of those rules done. And those are not small undertakings. Those are things the agency has typically not done well, meet deadlines that Congress sets. And in my confirmation process and in my service here, I made a commitment to them we were going to do those things timely, and we did. So there is an absolute commitment to carry out the spirit, the letter of the law with respect to those updates that were made and provide clarity and accountability.
How do consent orders fit within that?
Well, consent orders, that is a little bit larger picture than just in the TSCA, in the area they're talking about. This agency for many years has used consent orders to regulate. And so I issued a memorandum last year that regulation through litigation is not how we should do business. You shouldn't have a litigant sue you, a third party sue you, go to a court, and then engage in substantive rulemaking as part of a judicial process outside of normal, typical rulemaking, where you take comment and you respond to that comment. Congress has given us very clear directions there. So what I've said about consent orders and consent decrees is that we shouldn't regulate through litigation. That's different than enforcement. If there are industries or companies out there that don't do what the law requires, we're going to issue consent orders and enforcement actions against them, and already have, to hold them accountable. But that's dramatically different than an agency using authority to regulate through litigation. That's something that shouldn't occur, and it's something we've stopped.
And so can you assure those who use household chemicals that this approach will make them safer than the old approach?
Absolutely. I mean, because from our perspective, when I speak to clarity, in regulations, I believe most companies, most states, most citizens want to comply with the law. They want to do what's right. But the regulations that we've adopted in a whole host of areas have not been consistent, so they don't know what's expected of them.
Would you say that's the environmental history of our country?
I would say it's the history of a lot of executive branch agencies. I mean, it's not.
That people want to comply and don't try to skirt the law because this agency was created in response to environmental problems that were a result of people not adhering to any kind of basic structures of environmental stewardship at all.
And look at the progress we've made, Major, in that regard. And that same area we were talking about earlier, those air pollutants that we regulate under the Clean Air Act that are so essential to our work here, 65% improvement, reduction in those pollutants since 1980. We've grown our economy substantially, but also reduced those pollutants by 65%. And most of that through investment in new technology and industry from the private sector. I mean, we can achieve a lot through government mandate. We can achieve more, in my view, through investment, cooperation, and partnership through innovation and technology from the private sector.
And that's the big philosophical difference between you and the Obama administration.
Look, when you look at this agency historically, it's the way we've worked before. I mean, that's the way we've always partnered with states. We recognize that the issues.
So the radicals were the Obama administration?
No, listen. I mean, when you look at Utah, the second most dry state in the country, Minnesota's not, and so you have issues that are particular to each of those states that we seek to partner and learn with them to achieve good outcomes with respect to air quality, water quality, Superfund. I mean, you and I have talked about Superfund quite a bit. Very little progress made. We have sites across the country that have been on the list for 30 to 40 years.
We're going to get to that in a second. The lead paint ruling from the Ninth Circuit. As you well know, the Obama administration took 6 years. This administration, this agency under your administration wanted 6 more years. Ninth Circuit said no. You need to put a proposed rule out within 90 days. Are you going to
working on it now?
Are you going to do that rule, or are you going to go to the Supreme Court and appeal that?
Well, I think it's the legal process is something that justice will obviously be the decider upon the procedural approach to that. But I can tell you this: it's important for us to get that rule and get it done. It's unacceptable for this agency, and it's not 6 years; it's 8 years. It took this administration 8 years to even consider the update to that rule. Another example: the lead and copper rule, that's the basis for all these things, came out in 1991. This agency has spent a decade updating that rule. So without question, Major, before we ever arrived here, those types of decisions took way too long. And that's what's been so striking to me, is the lack of urgency.
So within that context, what's your promise to the American public on those two issues?
We're going to do our job. We're going to do our job.
By when?
Well, that's something we've got a court we're working with. In that regard, they will set the time frame, and we're going to work to achieve that. I mean, it's a little bit unsettling, frankly, for the past administration to take 8 years.
No,
right?
And I'm just asking you what your different goal is.
I mean, we're working to do it as aggressively as possible and do it consistent with what the court says. But the point of the matter is this, is that the lack of focus manifests itself in so many ways. It's very important to look at that rule. It's very important to update the lead and copper rule that's been around since 1991. Our lead in our drinking water is a substantial challenge, a substantial risk.
Health threat.
Health risk to our youngsters across the country. Mental acuity of our children is being impacted in a very substantial way. We need to address that. In fact, one of the things I've talked about with the folks here is that we need to declare a war on lead. And we need to eradicate lead from our drinking water and set a goal of doing that within 10 years. It can be done. And it's a replacement of those service lines.
That's a big infrastructure.
That's a big infrastructure. It's a big infrastructure focus, but frankly, it's exactly what we ought to be talking about. The president's talking about it. When you look at his infrastructure package, folks look at that and they think it's just roads and bridges. The president has made such a major focus on water infrastructure to address these kinds of issues.
So just so I understand correctly, on the lead paint, the Ninth Circuit said 90 days. You say that's okay, or?
I say that the Justice Department is going to work through that process to provide clarity to us on the time frame, and we're going to work to meet that time frame, whatever it is that the court sets ultimately.
All right.
And it's important to do.
Let's talk about Superfunds.
Yeah.
What is different about your approach than the approach you saw and inherited from the Obama administration? And when will people know they're seeing something different?
What's already happening, and primarily it's just a focus. And look, people.
What does that mean?
Well, when you look at the 1,340 plus sites we have across the country, some of the most egregious environmental issues that we have in the entire country are Superfund sites. Sites that have lead and uranium buried in the soil, posing a risk to those in those communities, that have been cited as a national priority. I mean, in fact, we have, as you know, a national priority list. And these sites have been on this list sometimes for 25 to 30 years. We have one in St. Louis that I've talked to you about, Westlake. It's been on that list for 28 years now. We're going to make a decision on that this month. And what's been lacking...
When someone here in my audience hears, we're going to make a decision about that, what does that mean?
We're going to decide what needs to be done to clean it up. We're going to actually issue an order that says, here's what we're going to do to clean up that site over a certain period of time. And that's what's so amazing about this, Major. It's taken 28 years just to make a decision. Not clean it up, not remediate it. Just decide how we're going to do it. That's unacceptable. And that's one of the things that I've really noticed as I've come to this position, is that we feel like we've done things just by meeting, by talking about things, as opposed to simply focusing on results. I mentioned at the beginning, the president is so focused on getting results across a full spectrum of issues. And I think that's really what's carrying forward here. Let's get results. Let's provide certainty. Let's provide real, tangible benefit to American citizens by getting these things done and a plan in place to achieve, in this case, remediation of some very important sites.
And remediation means returning it to something that it can be used. And one of the ideas you've introduced is redevelop these Superfund sites. And I want to read to you something that was in the Houston Chronicle this morning. It's a direct quote from this article. Other sites of the EPA's list with redevelopment potential include former chemical plants, refineries, mines, and smelters once contaminated with toxic materials ranging from asbestos to arsenic, and that stretch coast to coast from Charleston, South Carolina to Portland, Oregon. Do people really want to develop these sites? I mean, with all respect, this sounds like something that comedy writers would put together, like, hey, great development opportunities, just remediated from asbestos, chemicals, smelters, etc. Are these redevelopment sites for real?
In fact, it's in Congress has established a program for years called the Brownfields Program.
No, I know, but
this is an extension of that. The same areas that the areas you've talked about also were found in former brownfield sites. Environmental harm that was substantial. I mean, those are blights on communities. and communities, cities and towns all across this country, you know what they want to do? They want to reclaim that. They want to redevelop it. They want to see it put to productive use.
So part of the conversation and the cooperation you mentioned is with developers.
It's with cities and towns and citizens across the country that say, how do we put this to better use? We talked about baseball before we came online. You know, a lot of baseball fields across the country are actually in those kinds of areas. You know, AAA parks and otherwise, where cities and towns that had environmental blights, those were repurposed, cleaned up. These areas we can clean up. I mean, that site, Westlake, the Westlake facility,
right.
uranium, that has been there since the Manhattan Project in the 1970s. That's an area that can be, we are working on, that's the decision we're going to make as far as cleanup. So when you say, can we do that? The answer is absolutely. Can we do it in every instance? Probably not. But the focus should be on what? Trying to reclaim, redeem those areas for the benefit of those communities that we serve across the country.
In that regard, can you give my audience a benchmark to measure you on that Superfund list and what you're trying to get done 10, 15, 20, 50 a year from now, or 2 years? What's a goal? You talk about goals and results.
That's exactly right. In fact,
how can the country measure you?
We endeavor, and I think we're going to see over 27 to 30 sites this year that we take off that list, either in a full or partial way. We hope that there's more. That has never been done in history, Major. So you're exactly right. We need to set goals, aspirations, but we need to set concrete objectives that we seek to achieve both in air quality, water infrastructure, Superfund remediation, getting these sites cleaned up, these rules that we need to update, some of which we've talked about here. This agency hasn't ever measured things before. And that's one of the things we're trying to incorporate into our decision-making process is how do we measure success day in and day out, week to week and throughout the year.
You know you have your critics, and some wonder if the people you have placed in leadership positions have the public's best interest at heart. Michael Honeycutt is the head of the EPA Science Advisory Board. He's quoted as saying once, "I haven't seen the data that says lowering ozone will produce a health benefit." He goes on to say, "It might have a negative health benefit." Do you agree with that?
No, ozone is something that we most definitely have to regulate. We're required to do so, and it has
linked to asthma, lots of other health effects.
It's a very important thing that we regulate. You know, in fact, I will tell you, this is something that we have noticed. We're making tremendous progress there. In fact, when you take out international pollution that transports and comes here from other countries, we actually have made tremendous progress. Some say that we've actually eclipsed the standard 70 parts per billion. So we need to, that needs to be a directive.
Right, so he's wrong about that. There is data and there are health benefits.
But ozone is something we must and shall and regulate, and we will.
There are others who also wonder about those who have come from industry who are in leadership position here. Nancy Beck, former Senior Director of the American Chemistry Council, now Deputy Assistant Administrator of the Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Protection. Now, some might listen to that history of work and say, I'm not comfortable with that. Why should the American public be comfortable with someone coming from industry and into this agency?
See, I don't buy the paradigm, Major. I mean, there's a paradigm that it's been pushed upon the American people the last decade or so. That we can't be both about stewardship and also development, economic development and growth.
This agency can be about economic development.
We should be about administering the statutes that we're required to administer, but we shouldn't come in and say that the way forward on environmental protection is prohibition versus stewardship. I mean, we've been blessed as a country with tremendous natural resources. We can feed the world and we can power the world, and we should do that. I think it's incumbent upon us to do that in a very, very sensible way with what? Stewardship principles in mind for the future. So this paradigm that says we have to choose industry over the environment or the environment over industry is the old way of thinking. Now that serves political ends. It serves political ends maybe across but it doesn't serve the environment. Because I will tell you this, to achieve what we want to achieve in environmental protection, environmental stewardship, we need the partnership of industry. I shared earlier with you that the progress we've made as a country, largely in environmental outcomes, has been through investment in technology and innovation by those in the private sector, not government mandate. And that is absolutely the case.
Environmentalism with industry.
We should be about stewardship,
is that right?
And we should be about partnership. And if we're about stewardship and we're looking forward, and knowing that prohibition is not what we should be about, but stewardship principles, and we should partner with those at the state level and industry to achieve those outcomes together, that's the best way forward, and it's what we've always done. Now, I will tell you, as a former Attorney General, I've led a grand jury. I've prosecuted bad actors. And I will tell you, if we have companies, industry, citizens who violate the law, we're going to prosecute them, and we're going to hold them accountable. But we should not start from the premise that all people are that way or all industry is that way. That is just simply wrong-headed, and it doesn't achieve good outcomes.
The first administrator of this agency, William Ruckelshaus, wrote an article recently. He talked about his fishbowl memo, and I'll quote it directly. "We started to release my full schedule and the publication of written communications on a daily basis. We held regular brown bag lunches with reporters who covered the agency, and every reporter knew he or she could attend. This is all in purpose of transparency as he defined it." Is that a standard you'd be comfortable with?
Look, I really believe, both internally and externally, that we should be about transparency. And
like that?
One of the things that I've talked about, as an example, is that as we've adopted regulations, some of the science that we've relied upon, we've commissioned studies, if you will. We've not done it ourselves. We've commissioned studies with third parties. And as those studies are published as part of our rulemaking, guess what we've done? We've also not published the methodology and data that undergirds that study. That's wrong. And so
you're going to do that?
That we're going to do that. That's a transparency. You know, that's the reason I've spoken strongly against the regulation through litigation. You shouldn't have two people in a courtroom making decisions about regulations that impact the American people. That should be in the open for everyone to see and to consume. And so rulemaking by definition, Major, is transparent. Because we propose a rule, we solicit comment, it's open for all the world to see. People make comments both on the science as well as the policy. And guess what we do? We're obligated to respond to that. So absolutely, we need to be about processes here at the agency that promote and advance that type of decision making, because that's how you build consensus. But here's the other thing. That's how you make smart decisions, informed decisions.
Is that how your Superfund task force operated?
Well, that was internal, as you know, and there were 80 plus individuals, 42 recommendations, 80 plus individuals across the country from regions that contributed to that study, and we had a short window of time. And so we made the study public after we drew the conclusions, and they're out there for all the world to see, and we're implementing those for all the world to see, and that is transparent.
Two last questions. Do you want to be Attorney General of the United States?
Look, I love, and I mean this, I'm thankful to the President, and I love what we're doing here. Domestically, this agency, and finding and shifting these attitudes to a stewardship mentality and providing regulatory certainty is so important to our future from an environmental perspective, but also the growth that we see in our economy. So I don't know where those things, those kinds of things come from, but I will tell you this, I'm a big fan of Jeff Sessions. I want him to be blessed in what he's doing. We're a family, and the cabinet really is a very close-knit group of people, and we're for each other, and I'm for Jeff Sessions.
Do you want to be governor of Oklahoma?
I want to be administrator of the EPA, and that's why I'm here.
And if the president asked you, as long as he serves, you'll be the EPA administrator?
I wake up each day in this position to do what I've shared, which is administer these statutes in the right way, commitment to rule of law, commitment to process, commitment to federalism. But overgirding that as well is blessing the president and helping him make decisions. I believe it's my role to help him make informed decisions and bless him those decisions as it impacts the areas that we address. And so I'm very thankful for the opportunity.
Mr. Administrator, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.